I really miss traveling. Hi everyone and welcome to Shaluso, and yes, today we are talking about GMT watches, dual time watches, watches that show multiple time zones. I'm going to be talking to you guys about what is the difference between a dual time and a GMT, as well as what is the difference between a True GMT and a Caller GMT, and why you would want one of the other in both cases. But let's start out with the difference between a dual time watch and a GMT watch. So a dual time watch, as the name suggests, is any watch that shows two time zones. Now this is often done in the form of a fourth hand. This can be circulating the dial in a 24-hour cycle from the center. It can be circling it in a 12-hour cycle from the center in some cases, or it can be on a sub-dial as well. But the point is you have a fourth hand somewhere on the watch that is showing you a different time zone to that on the main three hands that show your local time, the time where you are. Now these differ from GMT watches, proper GMT watches, in that they don't have a rotating bezel, because the rotating bezel is what allows you to track a third time zone in addition to the two shown on the dial. Now I'll make a separate video on how a GMT watch actually works, especially in terms of using the bezel, but the biggest difference here is the bezel itself. So an example of a dual time watch that works as a True GMT would be something like the Grand Seiko SBGC223. With this watch, you have a 24-hour scale on the outside, but it is a fixed bezel. You have a fourth hand that makes a rotation once every 24 hours, and you have an independently jumping hour hand that shows your local time. An example of a Caller GMT that is just a dual time watch is the Panerai Luminor GMT PAM 00161. In this case, you have a modified Bezel movement that adds a fourth hand that makes one rotation every 24 hours, and you can read that along the scale of the outside. So you see your local time, the time where you are on the main hands, and then you can move around that GMT hand to see what's happening in another time zone. In terms of proper GMTs, an example of a True GMT that's an actual proper GMT watch, of course we have the Rolex GMT Master 2, the one that essentially invented the segment of the GMT watch. And then an example of a Caller GMT, you have my Steinhart Ocean One GMT. Again, has a rotating bezel with a 24-hour scale. However, you also have a moving GMT hand that shows a separate time zone from the hour hand at center, and you can read up to 3 time zones on that as well. But this brings us to the difference then between what is a Caller GMT and a True GMT. These are words, especially True GMT, that are thrown around a lot. In general, favor is given to the True GMT because it's most attuned to the original purpose of a GMT watch, which was to make a watch for people who travel a lot. So starting with a True GMT, of course the best example is the Rolex GMT Master 2 itself. And what a True GMT is one in which the hour hand on the watch can move independently of the GMT hand, and it jumps at 1 hour increments. So the purpose of this was originally for pilots because they would travel a lot, but obviously you would have a home base. For example, a pilot who's based out of New York, but in the space of a week, for example, they might travel to Los Angeles, to Dubai, to London. So every time they go to a different time zone, they still want to know what time it is at home. So that would largely remain static. The one that you want to move regularly is your hour hand at center, because your local time, the time where you are, is what's changing the most and what's changing most frequently. The idea would be that you would take off in New York, land in Los Angeles, and you would just move your hour hand while still being able to see what time it is back home, and without having to hack the seconds to do so. And obviously not all of us are pilots, but this is what would be best attuned for someone who travels often. Obviously in recent times, most of us aren't doing that much traveling, but as things start to improve, of course, that's where it would be most advantageous. If you're someone whose local time changes more often, then you would want to have a True GMT, because it means that you can change the hours on the fly without having to reset your watch completely, and it's easy to switch it back, and you can track what's still going on at home where you might have family, business interests, etc. On the other hand, you have what's known as a Caller GMT. This is called as such because it's more for those people who are calling people in other time zones, but your local time, the time where you are, stays pretty much the same. In my case, for example, I do a lot of business with people who are in other countries other than where I live. So for me, it's more useful not changing my local time, the main 3 hands on my watch, because I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. But what I do have to do is if I acquire a client in another country, then I need to make sure I know what time it is in their country so I don't call them at 3 in the morning or so that I'm aware of when their business day ends, for example. So to do that, you use what's known as a Caller GMT. This is one where the jumping hour hand isn't your main hour hand. Instead, it is that 4th hand, the one that cycles in 24-hour increments, the one that doesn't show the time where you are. In these cases, what you'll have is you'll have your 4th hour hand that will jump just by turning the crown, and this will often be linked to the 2nd position of the crown, the same position as the quick set. However, the date change is still obviously linked to what happens on the main hand. So these are actually the more common variant. The most common example in terms of movements is the Sellita SW330 or the ETA 2893, and these are generally cheaper. They're generally looked down a little bit because they're not the true GMT, but they do have a practical application in that they're useful for most of us now, especially due to the pandemic, who aren't traveling as much, but instead the changing dynamic is what happens outside of where we live. So we want to keep our local time, our main 3 hands static and on the same time zone, but we might want to change it around to see what time it is in other places. So really in the grand scheme, a lot of it depends on what your actual needs are, not so much what is sort of the more traditional. Some people may prefer it because the more traditional and because the original design was for a true GMT. However, it's important to bear in mind that a lot of it comes down to practicality and what works best for you. So that's just a brief summary of the difference between a Caller GMT and a true GMT, a dual time and a proper GMT watch. Let me know in the comments below which of these combinations resonates best with you. Which would be the best one for your particular lifestyle? What's your favorite multi-time zone watch, if we want to put sort of a general term for all of these? And if you think that one version is better than the other, let me know why. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, keep a lookout for when I put up my video on how a GMT bezel works. I'll go into more detail on how you can actually track up to 3 time zones at one time on the same watch by using that bezel. But of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more pictures and infographics as featured throughout this and all my other videos, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shaluso. And if you want to keep seeing new watch videos, then make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell as well so you know when the next video comes out. In any case, thanks for watching this video and we'll catch you on the next one.